Don't open that door! The desperate shout echoed through the pristine marble corridors of the 42nd floor, causing every executive in their tailored suits to freeze mid-stride. Marcus Thompson's voice, usually so quiet and unassuming as he pushed his cleaning cart through these halls, now carried a raw urgency that made the air itself seem to vibrate with tension. His weathered hands, still gripping the mop handle, trembled as he stood between the mahogany door and Richard Blackstone, the CEO of Blackstone Industries, whose hand had been inches from the gold-plated handle. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to flicker, casting shadows across Marcus's face as sweat beaded on his forehead, his chest heaving from having sprinted across the entire floor. The cleaning supplies on his cart rattled from the sudden stop, the sound sharp and metallic in the stunned silence. Behind the door, a faint sound could be heard, something between a whimper and a shuffle, that made Marcus's eyes widen with a fear that went beyond losing his job. The other executives, frozen in a tableau of corporate confusion, watched as their usually invisible janitor stood defiantly before the most powerful man in the building. Time seemed to stretch like taffy as the two men locked eyes, one in a $1,000 suit, the other in a faded blue uniform with his name stitched in white thread. The moment hung suspended in the corporate atmosphere, where normally the only sounds were keyboards clicking and deals being made over conference calls. If you've ever witnessed a moment where social hierarchy suddenly meant nothing, where human instinct overrode every protocol, share where you're watching from, because this story will remind you that heroes wear many uniforms, and sometimes the most important moments happen when we least expect them. The tension in that hallway was palpable, like the air before a thunderstorm, and everyone present could feel that something monumental was about to unfold. Marcus Thompson, 43 years old, single father of two, had worked these floors for 7 years, arriving each night at 6 p.m. when the suits were leaving, ensuring their world remained spotless for the next morning's ambitions. His story wasn't one that usually mattered in these halls of power, where million-dollar decisions were made without a thought to the man who emptied the trash bins. Yet here he stood, his entire body a barrier between the CEO and that door, his brown eyes filled with a determination that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than job protocol. The executives around them began to murmur, their confusion growing as they watched their janitor, a man most of them had never even noticed, challenge the very foundation of corporate order. Sarah Mitchell, the CFO, still held her phone mid-call, the voice on the other end asking if she was still there, but she couldn't respond, transfixed by the scene before her. Marcus had started his shift like any other Tuesday evening in downtown Chicago, the October wind howling against the skyscraper's windows as he prepared his supplies in the basement storage room. The photograph tucked into his wallet, Emma 9 and Tyler 7, smiling gap-toothed smiles at Navy Pier, reminded him why he worked these long nights, why he sacrificed sleep to attend their school plays and parent-teacher conferences during the day. His wife Caroline had been gone for 3 years now, taken by a cancer that had eaten through their savings faster than it had eaten through her body, leaving him with medical debt that felt like a mountain and 2 children who still sometimes called out for their mother in their sleep. The janitorial job at Blackstone Industries wasn't glamorous, but it provided health insurance and steady pay, enough to keep their small apartment in Bridgeport and food on the table. He knew every inch of this building, from the executive floors to the parking garage, had memorized the rhythms and patterns of corporate life that pulsed through these walls. Tonight had started with him refilling soap dispensers and replacing paper towels, the mundane tasks that kept this gleaming tower of capitalism functioning. But as he'd worked his way up to the 42nd floor, something had been different, a sound that didn't belong, a disruption in the usual evening quiet that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He'd followed that sound, his cart's wheels squeaking on the polished floor, until he'd heard it clearly. Soft crying coming from behind the door to conference room C. The conference room was supposed to be empty. Marcus had checked the schedule, as he always did, ensuring he wouldn't interrupt any late meetings or sensitive discussions. But the crying continued, young and frightened, and as he'd approached the door, he'd seen something that made his paternal instincts override every employment protocol. A small backpack, pink with unicorn patches, tucked behind a potted plant near the door. He recognized that backpack because it was identical to one Emma had begged for at Target last month, the one he'd had to put on layaway and pay for over 3 weeks. The math in his head was quick and terrible. A child's backpack, crying behind a locked door and the executive floor empty except for him. His hand had been reaching for his master key when he'd heard the elevator ding and seen Richard Blackstone himself stride out, followed by his entourage of vice presidents and assistants. The CEO moved with the confidence of a man who owned everything he surveyed, his silver hair perfectly styled, his shoes clicking against the marble with metronomic precision. Marcus had watched in growing alarm as Blackstone headed directly for Conference Room C, saying something about retrieving documents from earlier's merger discussion. That's when Marcus had run, his work boots slipping on the freshly mopped floor, his voice breaking through years of trained silence. Richard Blackstone stood 6'3" in his Italian leather shoes, a man who had built his empire from a small investment firm to a multinational corporation worth billions, and he was not accustomed to being told what to do by anyone, let alone a janitor. His grey eyes, which had stared down board members and crushed competitors, now focused on Marcus, with a mixture of incredulity and growing anger. The Rolex on his wrist caught the light as he lowered his hand from the door handle, his jaw clenching in a way that his executives recognized as the precursor to someone being fired. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice low and dangerous, the kind of tone that had ended careers and destroyed smaller companies. The other executives shifted nervously, some already pulling out their phones to record what would surely be the janitor's last moments as an employee. Marcus swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his children's futures pressing on his shoulders, knowing that what he said next would determine whether they had food next month or faced eviction. But behind that door, the crying had stopped, replaced by a silence that was somehow worse, and Marcus thought of Emma and Tyler safe at home with Mrs. Chen from next door, and knew he couldn't walk away. "Mr. Blackstone, sir, please. You can't open that door, not yet," Marcus said, his voice steadier now, his hands moving from the mop to hang at his sides, ready but not threatening. The CFO, Sarah Mitchell, stepped forward, her expression caught between concern and corporate loyalty. She'd actually spoken to Marcus before, one late night when her divorce papers had been spread across her desk, and he'd quietly left a fresh cup of coffee by her door without a word. "Richard, maybe we should listen," she started, but Blackstone raised a hand, silencing her with the gesture. The power dynamic in the hallway was shifting like tectonic plates, slow but inexorable, as more executives gathered, drawn by the unprecedented spectacle of their janitor blocking their CEO. Marcus could feel their eyes on him, some dismissive, others curious, a few almost sympathetic. He thought of all the conversations he'd overheard while being invisible, the deals and betrayals, the casual cruelties disguised as business decisions. He'd cleaned up after their celebrations and their failures, had seen them at their best and worst, always silent, always professional. But this was different. This was about something more important than stock prices or quarterly reports. The security guard by the elevator, Tom Bradley, shifted uncomfortably, his hand moving to his radio. He and Marcus had shared many quiet nights, talking about their kids, about the Bears' chances this season, about the way the city looked from up here when the lights sparkled like stars below. Tom's eyes met Marcus's, and in them was a question and a warning. Whatever was happening, it was about to escalate. The mahogany door stood between them all like a monument to secrets, its brass handle gleaming under the recessed lighting. Marcus could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the sweat making his uniform stick to his back. 7 years of perfect attendance, of never complaining, of being the model employee who kept his head down and did his work. All of it balanced on this moment. Behind him, he heard the wheel of his cart squeak as someone brushed against it, the familiar sound grounding him in the surreal situation. Blackstone's face had gone from angry to calculating, the expression of a man reassessing a situation, gathering data before making a decision. "You have exactly 10 seconds to step aside, or security will remove you and you'll be prosecuted for trespassing," Blackstone said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. The executives around them seemed to hold their breath collectively, waiting to see if the janitor would fold under the pressure. Marcus felt his knees wanting to buckle, felt the very real fear of losing everything he'd worked for, but then he heard it again, a soft thump from behind the door like something or someone falling against it. His children's faces flashed in his mind, not just Emma and Tyler, but the child behind that door who needed someone to stand up, to break the rules, to be brave when it mattered most. The fluorescent light above them hummed, casting harsh shadows that made everyone look older, more tired. Marcus straightened his shoulders, his blue uniform with its coffee stains and bleach marks suddenly feeling like armor. "Mr. Blackstone, there's a child in that room. A scared child. And I think you need to listen to why they're there before you open that door." The words landed like a brick through a window, shattering the corporate facade with their simple truth. Several executives gasped, phones coming out not to record a firing, but something potentially far more serious. Blackstone's face went through a series of expressions. Shock, confusion, then something that might have been fear. "That's impossible. This floor is restricted access," he said, but his voice had lost its commanding edge. Sarah Mitchell was already pulling up security footage on her tablet, her fingers flying across the screen. The cluster of suits pressed closer, their earlier mockery replaced by genuine concern. Marcus remained where he stood, a blue-collar guardian in a white-collar world, his body language saying what his words couldn't. He would not move until this was resolved safely. The sound from the room came again, clearer this time, definitely a child's voice, weak and frightened. One of the younger executives, a man Marcus recognized as David Chen from Mergers and Acquisitions, stepped forward. "Should we call the police?" he asked, his usual confidence shaken. Marcus shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving Blackstone's face. "Not yet. First, we need to know how a child got up here and why they're locked in that room." The weight of his words, coming from a man they'd all ignored for years, carried an unexpected authority. He'd cleaned these rooms, had seen the forgotten items, and overheard the secrets. He knew that Conference Room C had been used for a board meeting that morning, had cleaned it himself at 6:30 p.m. before he'd been called away to handle a spill in the lobby. The timeline was forming in his mind, pieces clicking together like a puzzle he didn't want to complete. The pink backpack, the locked door, the child's cry, and the fact that someone had locked that door from the outside. His master key ring hung heavy on his belt, and he knew that only 3 people had access to lock these conference rooms: himself, the head of security, and Richard Blackstone. Sarah Mitchell looked up from her tablet, her face pale in the artificial light. "Richard, the security footage from this afternoon," she began, then stopped, her eyes widening as she looked between her CEO and the janitor. The tension in the hallway ratcheted up another notch, the kind of tension that preceded corporate scandals and newspaper headlines. Marcus watched as Blackstone's confident facade began to crack, tiny fissures spreading like spiderwebs across his composed exterior. The other executives were backing away now, creating distance between themselves and whatever was about to be revealed. Tom Bradley had his radio out, but hadn't called for backup yet, waiting to see how this played out. The child behind the door had gone quiet again, and Marcus wondered if they were listening, if they could hear that help was just outside. His own childhood came flooding back, hiding in closets while his parents fought, the feeling of being small and powerless in an adult world that didn't make sense. "Mr. Thompson," Blackstone said, and Marcus was surprised the CEO knew his name. "You don't understand the full situation here." The words were meant to be commanding, but they came out almost pleading. Marcus felt the shift in power like a physical thing, the invisible janitor suddenly holding all the cards in a game he'd never asked to play. The marble floor beneath his feet, which he'd mopped 1,000 times, felt more solid than ever. He thought of all the nights he'd worked here, invisible and dismissed, cleaning up messes both literal and metaphorical. Now, in this moment, his presence was undeniable, his voice impossible to ignore. "Then explain it to me, sir. Explain why there's a child locked in that conference room." The directness of his challenge sent ripples through the gathered executives. This wasn't how things worked in their world. Janitors didn't question CEOs. The hierarchy was sacred, unbreakable. But Marcus had already broken it, had shattered it the moment he'd shouted down the hallway. The elevator dinged again, and everyone turned to see who was arriving to witness this corporate standoff. A woman stepped out, her designer heels clicking on the marble, her face a mask of professional composure, until she saw the crowd, saw Blackstone's expression, saw Marcus standing guard by the door. It was Rebecca Blackstone, the CEO's wife, and the head of the company's charitable foundation. Her arrival added another layer of complexity to an already charged situation. She moved through the crowd of executives like a ship through water, her eyes taking in everything: her husband's defensive posture, the janitor's protective stance, the door that stood between them all, and whatever truth lay behind it. "Richard, what's going on?" she asked, her voice carrying its own authority, earned through years of being married to power. Marcus noticed how Blackstone's jaw tightened at her arrival, how his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. The pink backpack by the potted plant seemed to glow under the lights, a splash of childhood innocence in this sterile corporate environment. Marcus's mind was working overtime, processing details he'd observed over the years. Blackstone's schedule, his meetings, the people who came and went from this floor. There had been a meeting this morning with Child Protective Services about the company's new youth outreach program, but that had ended at noon. The conference room should have been empty and locked by 12:30. Yet here they were at 8:47 p.m., with a child somehow trapped inside. The pieces were forming a picture that Marcus didn't want to see but couldn't ignore. He thought of his own children, safe at home, and felt a fierce protectiveness for the unknown child behind the door. "Mrs. Blackstone," Marcus said, addressing her directly, breaking another unspoken rule. "There's a child in that conference room. They've been crying. We need to get them out safely." Rebecca Blackstone's composed facade cracked, her eyes darting between her husband and the door. "A child? Whose child?" The question hung in the air like smoke, toxic and suffocating. Sarah Mitchell held up her tablet, showing the security footage she'd found, and Rebecca took it with hands that Marcus noticed were trembling slightly. The other executives had formed a loose circle now, close enough to hear, but far enough to claim plausible deniability if this went south. Marcus watched the CEO's wife's face change as she viewed the footage, watched her expression go from confusion to recognition to something that looked like horror. "Oh my God, Richard, is this about the Henderson case?" The name meant nothing to Marcus, but he saw how it affected Blackstone, saw the man actually take a step back as if physically struck. The story was coming together now, whispered between the executives who were piecing together fragments of information. The Henderson case, a custody battle involving one of Blackstone Industries' junior executives who'd been fired 6 months ago after reporting financial irregularities. Marcus remembered cleaning out that office, remembered finding a photo of a young girl with bright eyes and a gap-toothed smile, not unlike his own Emma. The executive's whispers grew louder. Custody evaluation, whistleblower retaliation, sealed court documents. The child behind the door wasn't random. This was connected to something bigger, something that could bring down more than just a CEO. Marcus felt the weight of being an unwitting guardian to not just a child, but potentially to evidence of something that ran deep into the company's foundation. His simple act of protective instinct had uncovered something that all the corporate lawyers and compliance officers had missed or ignored. The marble hallway, with its expensive art and polished surfaces, suddenly felt like a crime scene. The silence that followed Rebecca Blackstone's question about the Henderson case was deafening, broken only by the low hum of the building's ventilation system and the distant sound of sirens somewhere in the Chicago night. Marcus watched as husband and wife locked eyes across the crowded hallway, an entire conversation happening without words, the kind of communication that comes from 23 years of marriage and shared secrets. His own memories of silent conversations with Caroline flooded back. The look she'd given him when the doctor said, "Stage 4", the way her eyes had said goodbye long before her voice could no longer form the words. The weight of being the only parent, the only protector, the only one standing between his children and a world that didn't care about their loss, pressed down on him now as he stood protecting another child. The executives around them were growing restless, their initial shock giving way to the calculating looks of people trying to figure out how to distance themselves from whatever scandal was about to break. Marcus could see them already composing emails in their heads, crafting alibis, preparing to throw anyone and everyone under the bus to save themselves. But he remained fixed in place, his body a dam holding back the flood of corporate self-preservation that would sweep away any chance of justice for the child behind that door. Sarah Mitchell was the first to break the silence, her voice cutting through the tension with surgical precision. "We need to get that child out of there now. Everything else can wait." Her words carried the authority of someone who'd climbed the corporate ladder not through connections, but through competence, and several executives nodded in agreement. But Richard Blackstone raised his hand again, that imperial gesture that had silenced so many boardrooms, and Marcus saw something in his eyes that made his stomach turn. Not guilt, but calculation. The look of a man trying to figure out how to spin this to his advantage. The CEO's mind was clearly racing, processing variables and outcomes like the human computer he'd trained himself to be. Marcus had seen that look before 7 years ago, when Blackstone had announced layoffs that would streamline operations, while standing in front of a banner celebrating record profits. 300 people had lost their jobs that day, and Marcus had spent the night cleaning out their desks, finding family photos and children's drawings, the detritus of lives upended by a PowerPoint presentation. The memory of that night merged with an older one, coming home from the hospital after Caroline's last treatment had failed, finding Emma and Tyler asleep on the couch, wearing their mother's scarves like superhero capes. They'd been waiting for her to come home, not understanding that she never would again. Marcus had stood in the doorway of their small apartment, still wearing the same clothes he'd worn for 3 days straight, and realized that he was all they had left. The fear he'd felt then was nothing compared to what he felt now, knowing that confronting Blackstone could cost him his job, their health insurance, their stability. But he also remembered what Caroline had said near the end, when the morphine made her honest in ways that scared him. "Promise me you'll teach them to stand up for what's right, even when it costs everything." He'd promised, holding her hand that had become so thin he could see every bone, and now that promise was being tested in a marble hallway that cost more to build than he'd make in a lifetime. Rebecca Blackstone moved past her husband, her heels clicking with determined precision, and stood beside Marcus at the door. The action was so unexpected that even Marcus blinked in surprise. She was everything he wasn't, wealthy, powerful, connected, yet here she stood, aligning herself with the janitor against her own husband. "Marcus, is it?" she asked, reading his name tag with eyes that Marcus noticed were the same green as Emma's. He nodded, unable to trust his voice. "Marcus, you have children, don't you? I've seen their pictures in your locker during the charity walkthrough last year." The fact that she'd noticed, that she'd remembered, hit him harder than any threat could have. She turned to face the assembled executives, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from old money and older principles. "Everyone except Richard, Sarah, and Marcus needs to leave. Now." The executives scattered like roaches when the light comes on, their expensive shoes clicking rapid retreat toward the elevators. Tom Bradley remained by the elevator, technically following the order to leave, but staying close enough to intervene if needed. His presence was comforting to Marcus, a reminder that not everyone in this building was driven solely by profit margins and stock options. As the hallway cleared, the sounds from behind the door became more audible, soft movements, a whispered voice that sounded young, maybe 8 or 9 years old. Marcus's paternal instincts were screaming at him to break down the door, to get to the child immediately. But he knew that a traumatized child needed careful handling, not more violence. He thought of Tyler's nightmares after Caroline died, how his son would hide in closets and refuse to come out, scared that if he did, another person he loved would disappear. The parallel was too sharp, too real, and Marcus had to blink back tears that threatened to undermine his stance. The fluorescent lights above them flickered again, and in that brief darkness, Marcus saw Blackstone's mask slip completely, revealing something that looked almost like fear. "The Henderson child wasn't supposed to be here," Blackstone finally said, his voice smaller than Marcus had ever heard it. "Her father was supposed to pick her up from the lobby at noon, but he never showed." The admission hung in the air like a confession, and Sarah Mitchell's face went from concern to horrified. Marcus processed this information, his mind cataloguing the implications. A child abandoned in a corporate building for over 8 hours, locked in a conference room while executives went about their business. The pink backpack by the plant suddenly made sense. A little girl's belongings, probably containing the remains of a lunch that should have been eaten hours ago, maybe a stuffed animal for comfort, the things children carry when they don't know they're walking into a nightmare. Rebecca's face had gone pale, her composure cracking like ice in spring. "Richard, tell me you didn't... Tell me this isn't what I think it is." The story came out in fragments, each piece worse than the last. James Henderson, the whistleblower who'd been fired 6 months ago, had been fighting for custody of his daughter Lily. The court had ordered a supervised visitation at a neutral location. Blackstone Industries had volunteered their conference room as a gesture of goodwill that Marcus now understood was anything but. The visit was supposed to be monitored by a social worker, but she'd been called away to an emergency, leaving the child in the care of building security. Security had locked her in the conference room for her safety, when her father hadn't shown up. And then somehow everyone had forgotten about her, forgotten about an 8-year-old girl, alone and frightened. in a room with no windows to the outside world, just walls of glass looking into empty offices. Marcus felt rage building in his chest, the kind of rage he'd felt when the insurance company had denied Caroline's experimental treatment, when the bills had piled up faster than he could pay them, when the world had shown him exactly how little it cared about people like them. But there was more to the story, and Marcus could see it in the way Blackstone wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. Sarah Mitchell was already pulling up emails on her tablet, her expression growing darker with each swipe. Richard, James Henderson tried to pick up his daughter. Security has 6 calls from him logged between noon and 3 p.m. He was denied access to the building. The implication was clear. This wasn't negligence, it was deliberate. Someone had orchestrated this, had used a child as a pawn in a corporate chess game. Marcus thought of his own custody fears after Caroline died, how her parents had threatened to sue for custody, claiming he couldn't properly care for the children while working nights. The terror of potentially losing Emma and Tyler had kept him awake for months, had driven him to be perfect, to never miss a school event, to prove over and over that love was enough to overcome circumstances. Rebecca Blackstone was crying now, silent tears that she didn't bother to wipe away. She's been in there since noon. It's almost 9 o'clock at night. That child has been locked in there for 9 hours? Her voice broke on the last word, and Marcus saw her transformation from corporate wife to mother, the roles stripping away until only human emotion remained. The conference room had water and a bathroom attached, but it was still a prison, a corporate cell that no child should ever experience. Marcus remembered Lily Henderson now. He'd seen her once before, 6 months ago, the day her father was escorted out. She'd been in the lobby with her mother, watching as security guards carried boxes of her father's belongings, her small face confused and scared. The divorce had been brutal, Marcus had heard, with allegations flying both ways, the child caught in the middle of adult warfare. "We need to call the police," Sarah said. But Blackstone stepped forward, desperation clear in his voice. "If we call the police, the media will crucify us. The stock will tank. Thousands of people's retirements will be affected." Marcus felt his disgust rise like bile. Even now, with a child traumatized and trapped, Blackstone was thinking about money. It was Caroline's death all over again. The hospital administrators talking about bed turnover rates while she was dying. The insurance executives discussing profit margins while denying coverage. The funeral director trying to upsell him on a casket while his children cried in the next room. The system that put profit over people, that turned human suffering into spreadsheet cells, that forgot children in conference rooms because their parents had dared to speak truth to power. Marcus's hands clenched into fists, and he had to consciously relax them, reminding himself that violence wouldn't help Lily Henderson. The sound from the room changed, no longer crying but singing, a small voice humming a lullaby that Marcus recognized. It was the same song Caroline used to sing to Emma and Tyler, "You Are My Sunshine," but in a minor key that made it sound like a dirge. The effect on everyone in the hallway was immediate and devastating. Even Blackstone seemed to crumble, his carefully maintained facade finally collapsing entirely. Marcus knew that sound, knew what it meant when children sang to comfort themselves, when they created their own light in darkness that adults had forced upon them. He'd heard Tyler humming that same song at Caroline's funeral, his small voice barely audible over the sound of rain on the church roof. The memory threatened to break him, but he held firm, drawing strength from the knowledge that he could do now what he couldn't do then. He could save a child from unnecessary pain. "I'm opening the door," Marcus announced, pulling his master key from his belt. The weight of it in his hand felt like destiny, like all his years of invisible service had led to this moment. Blackstone started to protest, but Rebecca grabbed his arm, her grip tight enough to make him wince. "Let him do it, Richard. Let someone who actually cares about that child open the door." The condemnation in her voice was sharp enough to cut glass, and Marcus saw their marriage fracturing in real time, another casualty of corporate greed. He inserted the key slowly, deliberately, making enough noise so that Lily would hear him coming. "Lily, my name is Marcus. I'm here to help. I'm going to open the door now, okay?" His voice was the same one he used when Emma had nightmares, when Tyler was scared of thunderstorms, the voice of a father who understood that sometimes the world was too big and too cruel for small hearts to comprehend. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire building, a small mechanical noise that carried the weight of revelation. Marcus pushed the door open slowly, his body blocking the other's view. protecting Lily's dignity in this moment of rescue. The conference room was dark, except for the light from the hallway spilling in, and there, huddled in the corner between two leather chairs, was a small figure. Lily Henderson, 8 years old, wearing a school uniform that was wrinkled and tear-stained, looked up at him with eyes that held too much understanding for her age. She clutched a stuffed rabbit that had seen better days, its ear torn and hastily sewn back on. Marcus recognized the look in her eyes. It was the same look Emma had the day they'd told her Mommy wasn't coming home, the look of a child whose trust in the adult world had been shattered. Marcus knelt down slowly, making himself smaller, less threatening. Years of being a father had taught him that frightened children needed to feel in control, needed to choose their own rescue. "Hi, Lily. That's a nice rabbit. What's their name?" The normalcy of the question, the lack of panic or drama in his voice, seemed to reach her. "Mr. Hoppy," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. "He's scared." Marcus nodded seriously, acknowledging both the rabbit's fear and, by extension, hers. "I understand my daughter Emma has a bear named Captain Courage who gets scared sometimes too. Do you think Mr. Hoppy would feel better if we got you both some food? I bet you're hungry." The mention of food made her stomach growl audibly, and despite everything, she managed a tiny smile. Behind him, Marcus heard Rebecca Blackstone's sob, the sound muffled as if she'd covered her mouth. The thing about trauma Marcus had learned from his own children's grief was that it didn't always look like screaming and crying. Sometimes it looked like a little girl who'd stopped calling for help because she'd learned no one was coming. Sometimes it looked like a child who'd made a nest in the corner of a conference room with chair cushions, who'd drawn pictures on the legal pads to keep herself company, who'd used the executive bathroom's fancy hand towels as blankets. As Marcus looked around the room, he saw the evidence of Lily's 9-hour ordeal. The empty water bottles she'd carefully lined up, the wrapper from a granola bar she'd found in her backpack, the window she'd drawn on the whiteboard because the room had no real windows. Each detail was a testament to a child's resilience and an indictment of adult failure. The marble table reflected the fluorescent lights, creating harsh shadows that made the room feel like an interrogation chamber rather than a place where million-dollar deals were made. "Lily, there are some people outside who want to make sure you're okay. Is it all right if they come in?" Marcus asked, still maintaining his distance, letting her set the pace. She looked past him to the doorway, saw Rebecca Blackstone's tear-stained face, saw Sarah Mitchell with her phone already out to call for help, saw Richard Blackstone standing like a man awaiting execution. Her small face hardened in a way that no 8-year-olds should, and she shook her head. "I want my daddy. They said he didn't come, but he would never leave me. He promised." The accusation in her words was clear, and Marcus saw Blackstone flinch as if struck. The truth of what had been done, keeping a father from his child as punishment for exposing corporate corruption, hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Marcus made a decision then, one that would change everything. "I believe you, Lily, and we're going to call your daddy right now, okay? I promise he's been trying to get to you." He pulled out his personal cell phone, looked at Sarah Mitchell and said simply, "Find me James Henderson's number, now." Sarah Mitchell's fingers flew across her phone screen with the efficiency of someone who'd built her career on getting impossible things done quickly. Within 30 seconds, she had James Henderson's number, pulled from the HR files that technically she shouldn't have been able to access. But when you're the CFO, few digital doors remain closed. Marcus took the number, his thumb hovering over the dial button as he looked at Lily, who was watching him with a mixture of hope and fear that made his chest ache. The conference room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in with the weight of corporate sins and childhood trauma. As the phone rang, Marcus noticed something he'd missed before: security cameras in every corner of the room, their red lights blinking steadily. This child hadn't just been locked in. She'd been watched, observed like a specimen in a corporate experiment gone wrong. The implications made his skin crawl, and he saw Sarah Mitchell notice the cameras too, her expression shifting from concern to calculating documentation. Every moment of Lily's ordeal had been recorded, stored on servers that Marcus cleaned around every night, digital evidence of deliberate cruelty. The phone rang twice before a desperate voice answered. "Hello? Who is this? Is this about Lily? Please God, tell me she's okay." James Henderson's voice cracked with the kind of fear only a parent separated from their child could understand. Marcus put the phone on speaker, kneeling down so Lily could hear. "Mr. Henderson, this is Marcus Thompson. I'm with your daughter at Blackstone Industries. She's safe." The sob that came through the speaker was raw and primal, and Lily's face crumpled as she heard her father's voice. "Daddy," she whispered, and then louder, "Daddy, they said you didn't come. They said you forgot about me." The accusation in her young voice cut through everyone present like a blade. James Henderson's response was immediate and fierce. "Baby, I've been trying to get to you all day. I've been outside the building since noon. They wouldn't let me in. I called the police, but they said it was a civil matter. I've been screaming at security for 9 hours. Rebecca Blackstone stepped into the room then, her movement decisive despite her tears. She was not the woman who'd stood beside her husband at charity galas and corporate events. She was something older, more primal, a mother witnessing another parent's nightmare. She took the phone from Marcus with hands that shook slightly and spoke with an authority that brooked no argument. "Mr. Henderson, this is Rebecca Blackstone. I'm sending security down to bring you up immediately. If anyone tries to stop you, they'll answer to me personally." She looked at her husband as she said this, and the threat in her eyes was unmistakable. Then she turned to Tom Bradley, who'd been hovering in the doorway. "Tom, go down yourself. Bring Mr. Henderson up through the executive elevator. Clear anyone who gets in your way." Tom nodded and left at almost a run, his heavy footsteps echoing down the hallway. The power dynamics in the room had shifted completely. Rebecca Blackstone had taken control, and her husband stood silent, seemingly shrinking with each passing moment. Lily had started crying again, but these were different tears, tears of relief rather than despair. Marcus stayed close but not too close, maintaining that careful distance that traumatized children needed. He thought of his own reunion with Emma and Tyler after Caroline's death, how they'd clung to him at the funeral home, afraid that if they let go, he'd disappear too. The stuffed rabbit, Mr. Hyopi, had fallen to the floor, and Marcus picked it up gently, brushing off imaginary dust before handing it back to Lily. She took it with a small nod of thanks, her eyes never leaving the doorway, waiting for her father. Sarah Mitchell was documenting everything on her phone now, creating a record that couldn't be deleted or denied. She moved with the careful precision of someone building a legal case, and Marcus realized she was protecting not just Lily, but all of them from whatever corporate retaliation might come. "I need to tell you all something," Richard Blackstone said suddenly, his voice hollow and defeated. Everyone turned to look at him, and Marcus saw a man coming apart at the seams, his expensive suit unable to hold together the pieces of his crumbling empire. This wasn't just about punishing Henderson for the whistleblowing. Lily was leverage. Her mother, Sandra, is on the board of Blackstone Industries. They're our biggest competitor for the Branson contract. The plan was to use today's incident to pressure Sandra into withdrawing their bid. The confession landed like a bomb in the conference room. Even Sarah Mitchell, who Marcus suspected had seen the worst of corporate warfare, looked stunned. Using a child as a business negotiation tool was beyond anything even the most cynical among them had imagined. Rebecca Blackstone's face went from pale to furious, a transformation that reminded Marcus of storm clouds gathering over Lake Michigan. "You used a child as a bargaining chip?" Rebecca's voice was deadly quiet, the kind of quiet that preceded explosions. "You traumatized an 8-year-old girl for a contract?" She stepped away from her husband as if his proximity was contaminating. The distance she created was more than physical. It was the space between who she'd thought she'd married and who he'd revealed himself to be. Marcus watched this marital dissolution with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. He'd cleaned their offices for years, had seen the photos of their children, grown now, successful, distant, had noticed how those photos had gradually moved from Richard's desk to his shelves, then to drawers, replaced by charts and profit projections. The man had traded his humanity for stock options, his family for a fortune, and now the bill was coming due. Lily's small voice cut through the adult drama. "I need to use the bathroom." It was such a simple human need, but it reminded everyone that at the center of this corporate conspiracy was a child who'd been holding it together, literally and figuratively, for hours. Sarah immediately stepped forward, her maternal instincts overriding corporate protocol. "I'll take you, sweetheart. Rebecca, can you—" Rebecca nodded, understanding the unspoken request to keep watch over her husband. As Sarah led Lily to the executive bathroom, Marcus noticed the girl's dignified walk, the way she held her head high despite everything. Children were so much stronger than adults gave them credit for, but that strength came at a cost. He'd seen it in his own children, the way they'd grown up too fast after losing their mother. the way they'd learned to smile even when their hearts were breaking. The moment Lily was out of earshot, Rebecca turned on her husband with the full force of her fury. 23 years, Richard. 23 years I've stood by you, defended you, believed in you. I watched you become harder, colder, told myself it was just business, that the man I married was still in there somewhere. She pulled off her wedding ring, the massive diamond catching the light as she set it on the marble table with a decisive click. But the man I married would never have done this. He would never have used a child as a weapon. The action was so final, so definitive, that even Marcus felt its weight. He'd seen marriages end in these offices before, affairs discovered, lies exposed, but never with such clear moral authority. Rebecca Blackstone wasn't leaving because of infidelity or financial crimes. She was leaving because her husband had revealed himself to be something monstrous. Sarah Mitchell returned with Lily, who'd washed her face and straightened her uniform, trying to restore some dignity to her appearance. The girl's resilience was remarkable, but Marcus could see the cracks, the way her hands shook slightly, the way she startled at sudden sounds. These were wounds that would take years to heal if they ever fully healed at all. He knew because Emma still sometimes woke up crying for her mother, because Tyler still got anxious when Marcus was even 5 minutes late picking them up from school. Trauma in childhood left marks that time could fade, but never fully erase. The conference room's expensive leather chairs and polished table seemed obscene now, monuments to a culture that valued profit over people, that could forget a child because her suffering served a corporate purpose. The elevator dinged, and everyone turned toward the sound. Tom Bradley emerged first, followed by James Henderson, who looked exactly like what he was, a father who'd spent 9 hours in hell. His clothes were disheveled, his face red from crying and shouting, his hands clenched and unclenched repeatedly, as if he was physically restraining himself from violence. But when he saw Lily, all of that fell away. "Daddy!" she screamed, running toward him with the abandon only children possess, throwing herself into his arms with such force that he staggered backward. The reunion was everything Marcus had hoped for, and more. Pure love unmarred by the corporate machinations that had tried to weaponize it. James Henderson held his daughter like she was made of spun glass and steel simultaneously, fragile and precious, but also the strongest thing in his world. "I'm so sorry, baby. I'm so sorry. I tried to get to you. I never stopped trying," James whispered into his daughter's hair, and Marcus had to look away, the moment too private, too sacred for witnesses. But they were all witnesses now, complicit in their various ways in what had happened. Sarah Mitchell was crying openly, her professional facade completely abandoned. Tom Bradley stood at attention, as if guarding the reunion from any further corporate interference. Even Richard Blackstone seemed affected, though Marcus suspected it was more about witnessing the consequences of his actions than genuine remorse. The CEO's calculated cruelty had backfired spectacularly, and everyone in the room knew it. The story would get out, it always did, and Blackstone Industries would become synonymous with child endangerment, with corporate evil that even Wall Street wouldn't forgive. James Henderson looked up from his daughter, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Marcus. "You're the one who found her, who called me." Marcus nodded, suddenly uncomfortable with the gratitude in the man's eyes. He'd just done what any decent person would do, what any parent would do. But James crossed the room, Lily still in his arms, and extended his free hand. "Thank you. Thank you for being here, for standing up to them." The handshake was firm, the connection between two fathers who understood that sometimes protecting children meant risking everything else. Marcus thought of his own father, who'd worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table, who died at 53 from a heart attack brought on by stress and poverty. He'd promised himself he'd be different, but here he was, still cleaning up after rich people's messes, still invisible until moments like this. "Mr. Henderson," Rebecca Blackstone spoke up, her voice steady despite the tears on her face. "I want you to know that I will personally ensure you receive full compensation for what happened today. Not hush money, not a settlement with conditions. Proper compensation and a public acknowledgement of what was done to your daughter." She looked at her husband as she said this, daring him to contradict her. "I'm also calling our family lawyer. He'll be representing you, not Blackstone Industries. Richard will be finding his own representation." The implications were clear. This wasn't just a divorce. It was a choosing of sides, and Rebecca had chosen justice over her marriage. Marcus respected her for it, even as he wondered what had taken her so long to see who her husband really was. Perhaps it was like his own slow realization that Caroline was dying. Sometimes the truth was too big to see all at once. Lily had calmed in her father's arms, but she kept looking around the room with eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail. Children did that, Marcus knew, stored away moments of trauma and triumph to be processed later, in dreams and therapy sessions and quiet moments of reflection. She would remember this room, these people, this night for the rest of her life. The question was what story she would tell herself about it. One of abandonment and cruelty, or one where someone stood up for her, where strangers became protectors, where her father's love conquered corporate evil. Marcus hoped it would be the latter, hoped that his intervention would be the part she remembered most clearly. But he also knew that trauma didn't follow narrative rules, that healing wasn't as simple as a happy ending. "We should go," James said, shifting Lily in his arms. She was getting heavy, but he showed no sign of putting her down, as if he might never let her go again. "I need to get her home, get her some real food, let her sleep in her own bed." The simple domesticity of his plans stood in stark contrast to the corporate drama surrounding them. Sarah Mitchell stepped forward with a business card. "This is my personal cell. When you're ready, call me. I have every email, every memo, every piece of evidence about what happened today. I'll testify to everything I've seen and heard." It was a career-ending offer, and everyone knew it. Sarah Mitchell was choosing truth over her position as CFO, and Marcus felt a surge of respect for her. Not everyone in these towers was soulless. Some just needed the right moment to remember their humanity. As James carried Lily toward the elevator, she looked back over his shoulder at Marcus. "Thank you, Mr. Marcus," she said, her small voice carrying across the marble expanse. "You're like a superhero, but with a mop instead of a cape." The innocent observation broke through the remaining tension, and despite everything, Marcus found himself smiling. "Sometimes mops are better than capes," he replied, thinking of all the messes he'd cleaned, literal and metaphorical over the years. This was just the biggest one, the one that might actually matter. As the elevator doors closed on father and daughter, Marcus felt something shift in the air of the 42nd floor. The careful corporate structure that had allowed this to happen was cracking, and through those cracks, light was beginning to shine. The 42nd floor would never be the same after that night. As James Henderson carried his daughter into the elevator, the remaining witnesses to Richard Blackstone's cruelty stood in a silence that felt like the calm after a storm. Marcus Thompson, still in his janitor's uniform, realized that his simple act of protection had triggered an avalanche that would reshape not just Blackstone Industries, but potentially corporate culture itself. Sarah Mitchell was already on her phone, calling the head of the board, her voice steady as she reported what had transpired. Rebecca Blackstone stood apart from her husband, the space between them growing wider with each passing moment. 23 years of marriage dissolving in the fluorescent light of corporate malfeasance. "You're fired, Thompson," Richard Blackstone said suddenly, his voice hollow but still carrying that CEO authority. But before Marcus could respond, before the fear of unemployment could even register, Rebecca laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that echoed off the marble walls. "No, he's not. As of this moment, I'm exercising my rights as majority shareholder. Did you forget, Richard, that my father's trust still holds 51% of this company? Marcus Thompson just saved us from a lawsuit that would have destroyed everything my father built." She turned to Marcus, her green eyes fierce with determination. "Mr. Thompson, effective immediately. You're promoted to head of building security and employee welfare. Your first task will be conducting a full review of all security protocols, especially those involving visitors and children." The transformation on Richard Blackstone's face was complete. From corporate titan to defeated man, watching his empire crumble not from external forces, but from his own moral bankruptcy. Sarah Mitchell stepped forward, her tablet still recording. "The board will have my full report by morning. Richard, I suggest you prepare your resignation. The SEC will also be very interested in how you plan to use child endangerment as a business strategy." The implications were clear. This wasn't just about losing his position. Criminal charges were likely. Marcus watched the man who'd seemed so powerful, so untouchable, shrink before their eyes. It reminded him of watching the cancer consume Caroline, except this destruction was self-inflicted, chosen rather than suffered. Tom Bradley returned from escorting the Hendersons, his face grim but satisfied. They're safe in their car. The father, he wanted me to tell you, Marcus, that you've restored his faith in humanity. The words hit Marcus harder than any praise ever had. He thought of his own children, asleep at home, unaware that their father had just changed their lives forever. The promotion meant stability, meant college funds could actually be funded, meant no more choosing between groceries and gas. But more than that, it meant Emma and Tyler would grow up knowing their father had stood up when it mattered, had kept the promise he'd made to their mother. There's something else, Tom continued, pulling out his phone. The security footage from today, I've been reviewing it. This wasn't the first time. There are 3 other incidents over the past year where children of employees who complained or questioned company practices were detained. The revelation sent shockwaves through the group. Rebecca Blackstone actually staggered, reaching out to steady herself against the wall. Sarah's face went from shocked to furious, her fingers already flying across her phone screen, alerting legal teams and authorities. This wasn't just one bad decision. It was a pattern of using children as corporate weapons, and Marcus felt sick thinking about how many times he'd cleaned these rooms, never knowing what horrors had transpired within them. The next hours passed in a blur of activity. Police arrived, not the corporate-friendly detectives who usually handled white-collar crime, but the Crimes Against Children unit. They took statements, gathered evidence, and sealed the conference room as a crime scene. Marcus gave his testimony, his words careful and precise, making sure nothing was left out or minimized. Through it all, Rebecca Blackstone stood by his side, her presence a shield against any attempts to silence or discredit him. By dawn, the story had leaked to the media, and news vans were gathering outside the building like vultures sensing carrion. The sunrise through the floor-to-ceiling windows painted the marble hallway in shades of gold and red, and Marcus realized he'd been awake for over 24 hours. His phone had been buzzing constantly. Mrs. Chen checking if he was okay, his supervisor wondering why he hadn't finished his rounds, and finally, Emma calling because she'd woken up and he wasn't there. "Daddy, where are you?" her sleepy voice asked, and Marcus felt tears finally come. "I'm at work, baby, but I'm coming home soon, and things are going to be different now, better." He could hear Tyler in the background, asking if Daddy was okay, and Marcus's heart swelled with love for his children, for their concern, for their existence that gave meaning to everything he did. Rebecca Blackstone approached him as he ended the call. "You need to go home to your children, but first I want you to know something. My father built this company on the principle that business should elevate humanity, not exploit it. Richard forgot that, but you reminded me. The salary for your new position starts at $150,000 a year, with full benefits and educational funds for your children." The number was so far beyond what Marcus had ever dreamed of that he couldn't speak. It was Caroline's medical bills paid off. It was Emma's piano lessons. It was Tyler's dream of space camp. It was dignity and security, and the American dream that had seemed so far out of reach. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the same hallway, but everything had changed. The marble still gleamed, but now there were children's drawings on the walls, part of the new family-friendly policies he'd implemented. The conference rooms had windows now, real ones that opened, letting in air and light. Richard Blackstone was serving 3 years in federal prison, his fortune liquidated to pay settlements to the families he'd wronged. Rebecca Blackstone had taken over as CEO, transforming the company into a model of ethical business practices. Sarah Mitchell, who'd stayed on as CFO, often worked late with Marcus on new employee protection protocols, their unlikely friendship forged in that terrible night's crucible. But the best change was the daycare center on the 3rd floor, where employees' children could stay safely while their parents worked. Marcus had insisted on it, and Rebecca had made it happen. Sometimes he would stop by during his rounds. He still did rounds, even as head of security, because old habits died hard, and he liked staying connected to every level of the building. He would see children playing, laughing, safe, and think of Lily Henderson, who, according to her father's emails, was doing well in therapy, was back to being a normal 8-year-old who happened to have survived something extraordinary. On this particular evening, as Marcus prepared to head home to his own children, he found an envelope on his desk. Inside was a child's drawing, a figure in a blue uniform standing tall beside a little girl with a stuffed rabbit. At the bottom, in careful cursive, were the words, "Thank you for being my hero. Love, Lily." Marcus carefully folded the drawing and placed it in his wallet next to the photo of Caroline and the kids. Heroes, he thought, weren't people in capes who flew above the world. They were people who stood up when standing up could cost everything, who spoke out when silence was safer, who remembered that every person, whether they wore a suit or a uniform, mattered. As he walked through the lobby, several executives nodded to him with genuine respect. The security guards, many of them promoted from janitorial positions under his new policies, smiled and waved. Marcus Thompson, who had once been invisible, was now seen, recognized, valued. But more importantly, he had kept his promise to Caroline. He had taught his children that standing up for what's right, even when it costs everything, is the only way to live with dignity in a world that often forgets the vulnerable. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that every person has the power to make a difference, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Because sometimes the most important battles aren't fought in boardrooms or courthouses. They're fought in the moments when we choose courage over comfort, when we protect those who cannot protect themselves, when we remember that our humanity is worth more than any paycheck.